We're just going to pause that.
Mhm.
Maybe. It's not going away. And I have the live transcript going too.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you again, everybody. And I'll go on mute, but I'll still be here. So go ahead and take it away, John and Emily. And thank you again.
Okay, great. Great. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, we really appreciate being here and getting to share a bit of our knowledge. And yeah, and today we're going to talk a little bit about garden prep and planning. And Jen, are you able to share that slideshow?
Might be a minute for me to figure it out, but I'll get to it.
Okay, if you could share your screen with that, that would be great. But we can start with a little bit of introductions, just so you all know who we are. So I'm John Beaton.
And I'm Emily Beaton, and we run Fairhaven Farm, which, like Jen said, is just north of Duluth, up in Saginaw.
And yeah, and so then kind of how our presentation will flow today. Oh, here we go. We'll just give Jen a second here, see if she can get that presentation pulled up. We're at the farmers market right now. Actually, we kind of double booked ourselves. So Jen's helping us out and is able to share our presentation while our workers are inside selling our plants. And if anyone is interested in finding our starter plants, like Jen said, we sell these at both Whole Foods Co-ops locations. And then we're also at the Duluth Farmers Market on Wednesday afternoons and Saturday mornings. And we also, next week, if folks are local, we have our annual plant sale next Saturday. We're going to have some demos from some other farming friends. So we'll be inoculating mushroom logs, and we'll also be prepping a space garden to accept some perennial berry plants from a couple other, and we'll have some demonstrations from a couple other farm friends doing those things. So if folks are interested, that's happening next Saturday at our farm. And all that information can be found on our website at fairhaven.farm.
And also on our Facebook, you'll find more information about it on our Facebook page at Fairhaven Farming is the Facebook handle. And Jen, we're not seeing that slideshow yet. I'm not sure if you're able to share that yet.
I have it up on my screen. I'm not quite sure why it's not showing up on yours.
Looks like we've got just maybe the Zoom
It might
chat.
be the Zoom thing that is showing.
Oh, okay. I don't want that. Sorry about this, guys. This is my first time doing this. So it'll just take me a minute to figure it out. Okay. Is it showing up now?
There we go.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So you can go ahead and skip ahead a couple slides. We just did our introductions and stop on this overview page. We'll just give you a quick overview about what the presentation is going to be about, so you know what to expect. We'll just give you a little background on our farm and talk about the things that we do, and then dive into the garden prep and a discussion about soil health, and then into crop planning and goal setting. And then we've got a few books that we like to recommend to folks who are just getting started gardening or want to kind of dig deeper into some of these principles that we're talking about. And then at the end, we will have some time for questions or comments or discussion. So feel free to put your questions in the chat if you don't want to forget them, and then we'll address them at the end.
Mhm.
So go ahead and advance to the next slide, Jen.
Great, thanks. So Fairhaven Farm, like we said, we're located just north of Duluth, and we grow a variety of things. We grow fresh vegetables and herbs and cut flowers, and we grow on about a half acre. And our primary outlet for those products is our CSA, but also, in addition to the fresh produce, we also sell starter plants, which is a great complementary enterprise. Many of the things that we grow in our field, we sell as starter plants as well. So you can advance next slide, please. And so when we're starting to talk about gardening, we'll go in depth here, but just so you all know, the techniques and kind of philosophy that guides our field work is something that's referred to often as market gardening, which in essence means we're growing a lot on a small space, and we're growing at a human scale. So there's not a lot of heavy equipment. There's not a lot of tractor work other than initial field prep. And if you skip to that next slide, you can see another image here. This is a great example of the type of gardening that we do. Obviously, it's on a bigger scale, but what's nice about this is that we have standard bed sizes. So all of our beds are 30 inches wide and 100 feet long. And what makes this great is that you can scale this up and down according to your size that you have available. But just kind of standardizing the beds and making the beds permanent. Kind of their location is permanent and does not change. You can see we've wood chipped our water path. This, and we can go the benefits of this as we get a little farther along. So, and you can skip to the next slide, and this is just showing a couple items here. The image on the left is, well, our cute dog, but also an image of our broad fork, and that's a really important tool. This we use. This is one of the most important tools when it comes to garden prep. These are long 12-inch tines that fit perfectly in our 30-inch bed system, and we use that to kind of aerate the soil, deliver oxygen, help break up the compaction, and it's doing so without a rototiller motion. We're not destroying the layers and mixing the layers. We are just kind of gently opening the soil up. And the image on the right is teamwork, a bunch of people working together to apply compost and to apply wood chips. And we can go to the next slide there. Demonstrating again, human scaled. We have a very nice rototiller that we used for initial bed preparation. Now we are transitioning to a low or no-till system, which is working out great, but also just showing you kind of the scale of the beds. So, and we can move on here as well. And a bit about our greenhouse. Like we said before, we grow many types of starter plants, vegetables, herbs, flowers, many of the same things that we plant in our field. And we can go to the next slide. Just has a nice picture of our setup. We've got a really neat greenhouse. If folks are interested in visiting us, we got a lot going on. And we could go to the next slide. And
more cute pictures of the dog, we gotta get that in there every once in a while.
More cute pictures. And if we go to that very next slide, this we just wanted to highlight our relationship that we have with the co-op. This is our 4th season growing the starter plants, and the co-op has been instrumental in helping our business grow. and do a great job with what we do. So now we can really dig in. We can get into the garden prep and soil health. And so the main thing I want to emphasize here as we move forward is that, there's many techniques. Everyone has different techniques on how to prep their soil, how to grow their garden. And what we want to emphasize today is the soil health. Okay, the soil health is guiding the techniques that we use to prep our garden space. And so we're going to go kind of in depth into this. And because when I first understood this completely changed my mind on how I treated the soil and worked our gardens. So let's go ahead one slide. The main thing emphasizing when we talk about soil health is primarily the biology that is present in the soil. This is something that often gets overlooked, right? So if we compare the soil, the life that is in the soil, compare that to like a forest. Okay, you walk into the forest and it's easy to see many things growing. You can see, and also the living creatures, you can see different levels of life. You can see things living in the soil, things living in the trees, large animals, small animals. Now, the soil itself functions in basically the exact same way, except the food web becomes invisible at a point when you get into the soil. However, within the soil is millions, if not trillions, of microbiology. We're talking bacteria and fungus and single-celled organisms, up into smaller insects, up into earthworms. All of these things makes a giant food web. So this is just important to understand that there's many things living in the soil. Often those same bacteria, the same things that are living in the soil often resembles us, or that same biology that is present in the soil, sometimes literally the same biology is present inside our gut. And so we can skip to the next slide. And then also thinking about this, you think about the forest, so you understand the complex food web. Now, if you think about our own digestive system, this is how you should think about the soil. Okay, we eat vegetables, we eat food, we digest that food. Our biology in our body breaks that food down into components that our body can use. The same thing is happening in the soil. And what the soil eats is carbon material, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as organic material. This is essentially, you can just think about it as plant residue. So, which is essentially kind of what compost is as well, right? So you're taking carbon-based material, you're putting that in the soil. It's the same thing as you eating an apple. You put the carbon in the soil, and the biology present in the soil will break that down, and the waste product from the biology breaking that down then becomes food for the plants. And this is kind of a different way to think about it. It's not necessarily, I'm going to introduce my nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. It's like we're thinking about feeding the soil food, and the biology will make those nutrients available to the plants. So this is important to think about. Okay, so now we can go to the next slide with that basic understanding. And now we're gonna talk about kind of the soil health principles that will help guide you when you're prepping your ground, when you're caring for your soil. And this comes from the Sustainable Farming Association, which has done a great job summarizing this complexity into a couple basic points. So number one is keeping the soil covered. we're going to minimize disturbance. We're going to increase the diversity of crops that soil sees. We're going to try to keep living roots in the soil as much as possible. And then the bottom one's a little tricky on a home scale, but it's still important to mention, integrating livestock. And so we can go to the next slide and we'll kind of do a little bit more detail on each one of these points. Okay, so keeping your soil covered. Now think about when you're in a forest situation, what's happening. We're all of these soil health principles, we're mimicking nature. And often kind of when we mimic nature and we understand what's happening in like a natural setting, in a prairie grassland or in a forest, and we can use this knowledge and we can actually accelerate the process by which we build soil, and we can do a better job to protect the soil and protect the life that is in the soil. And number one is when you walk into the forest and you see, you'll see litter all over the forest floor, from leaves dropping to the ground, from grasses falling over and dying. What's happening is that soil is being covered. And so in a garden type setting or a field type setting, this means that you can, let's say, apply a kind of mulch, whether that's straw or wood chips. You can apply a mulch, which will help regulate the moisture, help keep the soil from drying out. It will kind of help with the intense heat of the sun if we're in kind of high summer. And it just will help protect that life in the soil and kind of regulate temperatures. Okay, and then number two, we can move forward. And that is minimizing disturbance. And this one I think is the biggest kind of eye opener, because the tendency in the past is to simply rototill. That is like the most basic form of garden prep. I have my garden defined, my field defined, and I'm going to run a rototiller up every square inch up and down. And that's kind of like, that's like what we think of when we think of garden prep. But
it's really tempting to see when you get that nice, clean looking prepped bed after you rototill, it just seems like you've done something right. But actually you've sort of disturbed the soil, and that's what we're trying to avoid in this method we're talking about.
Right. So when we till or are dependent on tillage to prep, what we're doing is we're taking the soil profile, the kind of layers that have built up over time, and we're mixing all of those layers, and we're kind of destroying the fungal networks that have been created, and we're destroying the porosity of the soil. Like if the soil is like a sponge, when you run over that with a rototiller, you're kind of destroying those pathways that the earthworms have created, and it causes compaction, and it actually then effectively kind of destroys the microbiology and also the macrobiology. I mean, we're talking earthworms, insects, other living creatures that are in the soil. And the other big thing is that whenever we bring soil from deep down, whether that's a couple inches or 6 inches, when we're bringing the soil that is deeper down and we're bringing that soil to the surface, now we've brought with that weed seeds, because there is essentially a weed bank in every bit of soil, anywhere, everywhere. There's a weed bank that will last the next 500 years. There's millions of seeds at all times present in the soil. And so when we bring that stuff from the bottom to the top, now you're exposing those weed seeds to the light and to water, which will cause a giant flush of weeds. So by minimizing disturbance, and we take care of and only disturb the top couple inches when we weed or use some of our other techniques that we'll discuss later, we're just not bringing those weeds to the surface, and we're protecting the biology that's in the soil. Okay, and number 3, this one's important. This is increasing the crop diversity. This is important. You know, you can think about this in a couple different ways. The common one is, you know, rotating your crops so that you're not planting the same crop type in the same place year after year. But the other way to think about this is introducing as much diversity as possible. And this can be done in several ways. You know, the most common way is to plant some kind of diverse cover crop. So this is something, a cover crop is something that you're not necessarily looking to take a harvest of. You know, this isn't something that this isn't like planting carrots. You're intentionally planting the carrot to eat it. The cover crop is purely to feed the soil. And when we plant cover crops, often what we'll do is, when we've made our harvests of the things we are intentionally growing throughout the year, to put the garden to bed, we will plant a thick stand of cover crop in our beds. And in our northern climate, where we get, you know, killing frosts, we'll select a mixture of things that winter kill, okay, that will die with the frost. So a common mix is like oats and peas. So the peas are fixing nitrogen, and the oats are providing a lot of biomass and really quick establishing roots. And so that diversity of the crops it's basically kind of like diversity is the key. So when we get a mixture of diverse crops growing in our field, we're going to attract different types of bacteria. We're going to attract different types of insects, and we're allowing the soil and the life in the soil to kind of balance itself. We're just giving the soil many options and allowing it to kind of balance itself. And also with that, you're getting with the diversity, you're getting deep-rooted things, which are going to bring nutrients from the subsoil up to the surface. We're getting shallow-rooted things, which is creating biomass that when that root system dies or is terminated, now the roots become food for the soil biology. It also attracts different insects or repels insects.
Another thing that to consider with cover crops too is that you can use them, certain ones, for, say, if you have compacted soil, if you have really heavy clay soil, you want to use a cover crop that has a deep root, like a daikon radish, for instance. That's going to really send one root, long taproot, down into the soil and bust through any compaction layers that you might have and sort of aerate that soil for you. And then that's something that also winter kills. So in the springtime, we did this last year. We planted a bunch of daikon radish, and this spring there was these large holes down into the soil. So that's
7 inches.
That's aeration. That's allowing some oxygen to get down into the soil. That's allowing the insects and biology in the soil to be able to work through there, and also for the water to access down into that sub layer of soil.
Right. So we're using the biology and we're using plants to achieve what we think we're doing with tillage. The biology and the plants are creating the great soil structure that makes a good garden.
It just started raining where we are, so I hope you can still hear us.
Okay, now we can move on to number 4. And this is keep living roots in the soil. This relates back to cover crops, though you can think about it as, you know, if you think about the kind of progression of the garden, you can think, okay, I'm going to plant a cover crop in the fall that will terminate, that will feed my soil in the spring. In the spring, that those roots, the debris is going to be present in the soil, and I'm going to plant right into that. Now I have crops growing throughout the season. When those are done, cover crops. So here, the idea is that we're keeping living roots in the soil as much as we can. And now what this does is this keeps the nutrient cycle flowing. This feeds the soil biology. And it actually, the living root actually attracts the biology. The biology in the soil will actually move towards the living roots, because what's happening as that plant grows, the roots are expanding, but the roots are also kind of dying off. Little pieces of the roots are constantly dying off and growing at the same time. That actually attracts the biology. And also another just amazing thing about living plants is that each plant has what's called exudates, which means this is like a substance that the root actually produces and introduces into the soil. And depending on the plant, that exudate has different qualities. So an interesting one is like squash. Okay, squash actually emits a substance which repels and prevents other things from growing around it. So the squash kind of has like a weed suppressing qualities that it exudes into the soil. Ryegrass also has this. So it's kind of interesting. And so, but basically just a simple understanding is that the living roots are key. It attracts the biology.
And again, that biology in the soil is what is feeding the plants.
Exactly.
So just allowing those plants to take up the nutrients that it needs to grow.
Right. The biology breaks down the carbon material, consumes that organic material, and its waste product is then uptaken by the plant roots. Okay, now we'll move on to number 5. And this is integrating livestock. And, you know, in a backyard garden, this may or may not be possible, but maybe you have a small flock, even just a couple chickens, you know, allowing them into that garden space, preferably in the fall, to kind of clean up garden residue, introduce their own manure. So you can take some basic principles about the livestock and understand what they're doing to the soil to help you also kind of guide you when you're building your gardens and maintaining your gardens. So if you think about a ruminant walking over a grassland, this is what we're trying to imitate, and this is what we're mimicking in the garden. Okay, when a cow walks across the grassland, what's happening is its hooves, right, its feet are pushing plants into the ground gently. Sometimes it's killing that plant and also at the same time pushing it into the ground. So now the biology starts to consume that plant and starts to consume that. So it's kind of like, think about, you know, it's almost like you're aerating the soil. You're and kind of like, you know, helping to introduce oxygen and introduce moisture into that, and carbon material into that top layer of your garden soil. It's also they're grazing on that the grassland, or yes, they're kind of grazing that green material, which then encourages the roots of those plants to grow and become more vigorous. And then it's the animals also introduce their manure to the surface, which their manure is where a lot of the biology comes from, right? So you're just kind of, you're adding to the soil with the animal. Now you can mimic this. Many of the techniques we've already discussed are mimicking what the animal does. When you add down composted manure, that's kind of like you've taken the natural process, accelerated it in your compost bin, apply that to the bed. What you're doing is introducing organic material that's semi-digested, and you're introducing biology to the garden. When we use our broad fork to kind of aerate the soil, this is the same kind of idea or the same kind of mechanism behind when a cow would be kind of walking over that grassland and aerating that soil. At our farm, we use our ducks. That's kind of a tool that we use. We only have 8 ducks, and we use this to kind of introduce fertility to our half-acre garden. So you can scale this up or down as well. So, and now I think let's just pause here for a minute. You can go to the next slide, but let's switching our minds into feeding the soil and feeding the biology of the soil. This is kind of to me, even as a professional grower, was kind of this eye-opening knowledge. So I just want to pause for just 1 minute and before we move on to see if anyone has any questions.
There's nothing in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourselves at this time and ask questions.
You mentioned using the livestock, and we have chickens. My husband sometimes likes to put in from their coop what they have in there, and it usually has wood chips in it. Is that a good thing? I keep telling him it's not, but I'm curious now.
No, that would be, that would work. However, we do the same thing with our ducks. We use straw. But you could apply that in different ways. I think what would be beneficial for what you're trying to do with the chicken bedding, because chicken bedding is high in nitrogen, which may kind of cause your plants to have kind of nitrogen burn. You're introducing too much of this nutrient at once. So if you can somehow compost those wood chips and give that some time to break down, I think that would be beneficial. So if you have like a compost bin or some kind of composting system, and then the wood chips are also highly carbonous. I mean, it takes a lot to break down a wood chip. So to get the most out of what you have, because that's again what gardening is about, is using what you have. What local resources do you have? If you've got chickens, you've got wood chips, that's a great thing, but maybe let those wood chips kind of sit for a year, sit for a season before you apply, or do a clean out in the spring, let them sit, and maybe try to mix in if you have some extra soil, or if you have some other green material, lawn clippings, some fresh cut lawn clippings, and you mix that material and let that sit, and let the biology that's present there do its thing, and start breaking down those chips and apply that in the fall. I think that's how you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck.
Wonderful. Thank you. We do compost it. He doesn't put it in for a year, but sometimes he puts it in the spring, and I'm always like, I don't know if I like that right before I plant. So, okay. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, Danette added to the chat. So what do I do with last year's bed? I grew up on a traditional farm that's tilled. I had a bed with cosmos yesterday. I pulled the old roots, sort of leveled it, and reseeded with zinnia. Was that correct, or should I have done differently?
No, I think that's okay, because, you got a couple options. You could, so if you have and now Yeah, and so all of these principles can apply. I have to get outside my box a little bit because I'm thinking in my bed system and planting very intensely, but same principles apply to any size, scale, shape of garden. So if you have your flowers planted, one thing that you might try to experiment with is, instead of actually pulling the roots up from last year's crop, you could keep those roots in the ground. Maybe you mow it or weed whack those things down to the ground, but keep that root in the soil. Leveling it's, totally fine. You want it to look nice too. But you might also we're thinking about adding to it. So in that scenario, I'm thinking about it in a very simple way, but you have last year's crop. What I would do is I'd take a fork of some kind and just go through that and, drive your fork into the ground and gently lever it back and forth, just to kind of create some holes, create some pores that will allow oxygen and water to penetrate. So you're just kind of loosening the soil rather than tilling it and mixing it. So loosen that soil and then add a little compost on top and your next crop. That's kind of a simplified way of thinking about how do I take my fall plants and get ready for the next crop. And even in the fall, often we'll leave that crop residue and we won't take and rip up all the roots and scrape up all the leaves. We won't remove all of that from the bed. We'll keep that there and let that biology break that down. It's just kind of this bizarre thing with, we got to rake our lawns, take all the leaves off our lawns. It's kind of like, it's actually more beneficial to kind of, just take your lawnmower off those leaves and kind of break them up into smaller pieces and let the soil digest those leaves. That's what nature's kind of trying to do. So.
Okay. Okay, and Danette had a second part to this question. If I have an area that had tomatoes or some greens, what do I do with that area now? Do I pull the roots, leave them? I don't exactly understand what to do. That might have just been or you might have already answered that, to be honest. And then third part is, I'm going to convert a perennial bed and some lawn to edibles. I really don't know what to do without digging.
Right. Okay. So now you can do this in a couple different ways. If you're converting a space, like you're taking grass or sod or perennials, if you've got some well-established big perennials, and you want to convert that to growing annual crops, you might actually have to do some manual digging to remove those if they're quite large. However, if you're prepping like a lawn or grass space, you're trying to turn that into a garden, I would suggest tarping. So finding landscape, like woven landscape fabric. They sell that at Menards or other kind of hardware stores, like thick or tightly woven landscape fabric. Or if you happen to have any pieces of thick black plastic or rubber tarp, anything that's gonna be kind of black and hold up, and you place that over the area that you're trying to create and turn it into a garden. And ideally you let that sit for as long as you can. So basically you have two options. You can till that. I mean, you can use tillage as a initial prep, right? If you want to get a garden going right now, you can run over that with the tiller and then start introducing these principles. However, if you've got time, you can lay down some tarp or black plastic over the space you're trying to turn into a garden. Let that sit all summer long, even through the winter. Let that sit for a full year and come back and you peel those tarps back, and that will have terminated all of your perennial grasses. It will have terminated your lawn or grass or wherever you're placing those tarps. And then you can start to establish where those beds are going to be. So in our system, like when we use our 30-inch beds, this is a perfect picture. You can see it on the screen.
Actually, skip to the next one. You might be able to see our tarp system. So we use these big sheets of plastic. They come in rolls of like 100 feet by 20 feet wide. And we use those to establish new sections in our garden. So those, like John said, we leave for one full season. We'll put them on there in the spring and then pull them back the next spring. And what we found is that it has helped us in our system immensely because we have quackgrass. That's our main perennial weed that we battle with. And this system helps terminate that. We have maybe only 5% quackgrass in those spaces. And so that gives us a clean slate to start with, and it is a lot easier on our bodies. We don't have to do manually removing all of those leaves, and it's a lot better on your soil too, because we're not disturbing those layers of soil.
And bringing more weed seeds to the surface. Right.
One thing too that you can use if you don't have access to silage tarp, this is pretty accessible material, but cardboard works. Put down a very thick layer of cardboard, make sure you have a way to weigh it down. What you might want to try with the cardboard is putting that down and then put wood chips or something on top of that, some kind of mulch.
And getting the cardboard wet too will help that break down. But essentially, we're smothering the weeds rather than trying to remove them or destroy them. And as we smother too like this, now the weeds have become a food source as they kind of basically terminate. Now they're in the soil. Now they become a food source for the soil. So it's actually now they're of benefit to you. So think tarp and think smother. How do I smother the space?
And I think just for interest of time, we'll just keep moving through the presentation. And of course, we'll have time for more questions at the end. So we can kind of take a look at that last slide that we showed. That's kind of an overview of our garden and our high tunnel. The high tunnel is where we grow our tomato plants and cucumbers. And then the beds, you can just see they're pretty standardized length, 100 feet long by 30 inches wide. And the tarps are opening up new sections in the field that we will use in the following season. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So for us, garden planning is very important. A good garden starts with good planning. And we like to do a lot of our planning in the wintertime, in our downtime. And you can see our dog here is helping us sort through our seeds. We do that every season, kind of just go through our seeds and do an inventory, see what we've got, see what we might be able to reuse from last year, or maybe we have to cull things that are getting too old. Generally, you can save seeds for quite a while, but just know that the longer that a seed sits, the less likely your germination rates are. So it's a good idea to kind of order maybe just what you need for this particular season or the next couple of seasons, and then kind of replenish your seed stock every few years. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So when you're planning for your garden, there's some considerations to take, some things to take into mind. Is your location, does it get full sun? Is it in partial shade? That's going to dictate like what kinds of things you can grow there. How much space do you have to work with? Different plants take up different sizes. So you want to make sure that if you want to grow corn, for instance, you've got plenty of space for that to be grown in. And if you have only a small space, you might want to think of things that can be grown on a small scale. Think salad greens or kale or chard, or things that can be even done in succession planting. So things that grow really quick, like radishes. And then you want to think about, we think about food crops a lot, but maybe you also want to grow flowers. Like, what is your garden going to do for you? Is it for enjoyment? Is it for beauty? Do you want to be able to produce as much food as you can on a small scale efficiently? Do you like to pickle beets? Do you want to grow a lot of beets so you can pickle beets? These are things that you can ask yourself in order to get your plan going. So you can go ahead and skip to the next slide. Also for us, I mean, we're talking very general here, but for our northern climate, we employ a lot of season extension techniques on our farm. And the easiest way to do that if you are in a cold climate is to either start seeds yourself indoors or buy them from a local garden center. That is going to give you a huge jump start with your season. And for us, I mean, we have a very, very short growing season in Duluth, so we wouldn't be able to do a lot of what we do without starting some seeds ahead of time indoors. And then, you just want to make sure you can plant your seeds out when all danger frost your seedlings out when the danger frost has passed, and you'll be able to find that for your zone. So I won't get too much into detail about that. We also use other things like row cover, and that's that white fabric covering you see in the background there to cover our plants, and that protects them a little bit from frost and also protects from some insects that like flea beetles. So those are just some options for season extension. You can go ahead and skip to the next slide there. And there's maybe something we should kind of back up a little bit to cover is when you're deciding what to plant. This can be overwhelming because there are so many options, but we like to kind of group things into families, plant families. And in terms of like the vegetable families, we've got, the brassica family, which is like your kale, your cabbage, broccoli. Then you've got your onions, your allium family, onions and garlic and leeks, nightshades, which includes tomatoes, potatoes, peppers. Then we have like the squash, family of squash and vines like cucumbers and melons, legumes like beans and peas. And then these are multiple plant families, but we like to lump them together, roots and greens. So like radishes, even though those are brassicas, we put them in this category. Greens like lettuce, carrots, beets, chard. These things are grouped together for us because they are kind of light feeders. They don't require a lot of heavy nutrients, a lot of compost. And then the other things, the other plant families each kind of require their own things. So that's why we group them into plant families. And so you can use those families to kind of design your layout in your garden too. So kind of grouping those things together so that when you go to plant again and you say you want to rotate and do a different crop in that space so that you don't get disease buildup or insect pressure for that particular plant build up in the same area. It's always a good idea to rotate if you have the space and do a different plant family in that section the next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, again, we're going to kind of concentrate on food producing crops, but like if I was on a home garden scale, I would, after assessing my size, my site location, all these different things, I would start to think about the different crops that I want to grow and things that are like kind of feasible and that are going to fit. And so we'll just talk about a couple kind of basic groupings of plants and things that I think like are kind of like standards in the garden. So there's some things like, I call these kind of like continual harvest greens. So like celery, chard, kale or collards, sprouting broccoli, or many kinds of like culinary herbs. These crops are super important because you can harvest off them essentially all season, and especially if you come and plant with a really strong, well-established starter plant, you can have food right really quickly. Like chard and kale, these are two of my favorite crops. There's a lot of people have kind of love-hate relationship with them. They either like them or they don't. But I think for our northern climate, where we live in a space where we only get a few months where we can actually get fresh greens, my body craves things like chard and kale as soon as the leaves start coming out and as soon as we start getting into the spring season. Even things like celery, which you wouldn't normally think of. You always get big full heads of celery in the store, but really celery will continue to grow if you harvest the outer stalks and let the main plant continue. And you can have kind of celery all season long and then harvest the full head in the fall. And so yeah, these continual harvest greens, to me, those are really important crops. And it only takes, 2 or 3 per kind of household to really give you greens on the regular. And then you have things that grow really quickly that you can do succession plantings of. Things like radishes, which you can have in about 3.5 weeks. That's incredibly fast for a crop. You can plant radishes every 2 weeks and you can have a steady supply of radishes all season. Or things like lettuce, where you can plant like a whole head of lettuce, or you can broadcast lettuce seed. And there again, you can kind of continually harvest that, or plant successions where you kind of have a constant supply of them. Or different types of Asian greens like bok choy or mustard, things like this that grow really quick. And again, you can do succession plantings of. See, to me, in the kitchen garden or a small home garden like this, it makes more sense to plant like things like this, your greens. Whereas if you don't have a lot of space, it's not going to make much sense to plant like the kind of larger items, things like corn, like sweet corn. Well, to get a dozen ears of sweet corn, you need a dozen plants, and that takes up a lot of space. So maybe that doesn't make much, unless you love sweet corn, right? It's all about what you enjoy growing. But sometimes it makes more sense if on a smaller space to plant the leafy greens, the things that you can get a lot of. But you also have like these long season crops that you basically plant them in the spring, harvest them in the fall, or continually harvest them throughout the season. But when you place them, they're going to remain in the same place. So things like a tomato, which is one of my favorite things to grow. There's so many different types of tomatoes out there it can be new and interesting every year. I love the tomato plant. Or its cousin, the potato, something that's going to take up a bit more space if you want to grow a lot. Or corn, squash, any kind of dried beans or fresh beans, or onions. Okay, another thing that's kind of like, well, it takes quite a bit of space actually to get 5 pounds of onions that you would pick up in the store. So maybe it's better to find the onions at the farmer's market and grow some quicker things. Or cucumbers, which, you cannot beat a fresh cucumber or a fresh tomato. So those are kind of long season things that will yield over time or will ripen in the fall. And then you also have kind of things to think about, like your storage crops. The storage crops are huge for us in northern Minnesota because of our short growing season. If we want to have those fresh ingredients available into the winter and fall months, the storage crops are critical. So we think of things like beets or carrots, parsnips, rutabagas, cabbage, leeks, these things that they can even survive a frost. They can hold into the field into, November almost. We've harvested kale in our field. It kind of
Thanksgiving.
right, for Thanksgiving, right? It kind of goes dormant. It slows in growth, but you can still harvest off it, and actually sweetens up with the frost and cold weather. And then other things which are staples at our farm, but also are great for the home gardener, the kitchen gardener, are just the culinary herbs. And here, as the professional grower, here's the most challenging thing to grow from seed, is the culinary herbs. This is something that, even we are learning and trying to master, but things like parsley, cilantro, mint, oregano, chives, rosemary, lavender, a lot of these things you start way early on, like rosemary, lavender. We start those towards the end of January and into February, because they take such a long time to germinate and mature. Or like you have different things that are perennials, like the chives or oregano, mint, things that you can establish and that are going to keep coming back year after year. So, but to me, the herbs, there's no substitute. You cannot find the herbs, quality herbs in the store, at restaurants, anything like this. There's no substitute for them coming fresh from the garden. They're full of life, and the kind of the compounds in them that give them, each herb, their unique flavor.
And not to discourage you from starting your own herb seeds, because once you have them, you'll be set, especially these perennial ones. Like, you can take the time to establish them, but then you've got them for a lifetime, basically. And even some of them you have to watch out for, otherwise they'll take over your garden. So like mint or oregano, for instance, those things you may want to consider like putting into a pot. That way you can even like bring it in the winter time and keep it over the winter in your house, and then put it back out again in the spring, so it doesn't kind of take over your garden space.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget about flowers.
Flowers are always a good idea.
Flowers are always a good idea. There's a million flower varieties you can grow, and we'll mention this at the end, but there's a flower grower that we follow and really find a lot of useful information from, so we'll pass that on to you.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the plan, I mean, ultimately it's just kind of like, well, what do you like to eat? That's what you should really grow. It's about having a relationship with the plants and a relationship with your food. Don't grow stuff that you don't like to eat. Grow things that you enjoy. And then the only other bit of advice is just to kind of, be prepared to store the extras, because that is so nice to have a little bit of that garden in the winter months when we don't have access to this fresh food. And just another thing about the value of growing your own food. And this relates back to the soil biology, right? So if you plant a garden, now you can't exclude yourself from this food web, right? You are a part of the garden as well. The biology that makes up you, because you essentially are millions and trillions of different cells, bacteria, microorganisms as well. So now when you plant a garden and you interact with the soil and you interact with your plants, you're literally exchanging that biology, and you too, the garden, the plants growing in it, and you are forming a relationship. You can't see it with your eyes, but you're literally exchanging the biology between you all. And that's why it's important to grow your own food and build a relationship with the soil, because now your body is becoming attuned to the plants that are growing on your site. And the longer you stay with that site and the more you interact with that, the deeper that relationship gets. I've even heard theories of the plants will understand what type of nutrient your body needs because you're communicating with the soil. And those plants will fix or uptake more of the nutrient that you need because you are interacting in that garden. So it's just kind of like shifting your mind to thinking about the soil as a living thing. And now it has personality. Now it has kind of more depth, and that interaction between you and the soil, that's a really, really magical thing. It's a really great thing. So, okay, we're nearing the end. We're talking about the fall cleanup. Somebody asked a question about the swapping the flower beds. So the fall is an important time because this now, if you do the work in the fall, you're setting yourself up for an easier time in the spring. So if you've got your garden beds, like I say, sometimes it's better to actually leave the roots in and not dig up the whole plant, not pull up the entire plant. You want to leave some roots in the soil because that's going to provide the food and structure for the spring. So when we think about putting our field to bed, what I think about is, you want to have that, think back to our soil health principles, keeping the soil covered, keep living roots in the soil. So like, let's say we're nearing the end of the season, your plants are kind of, winding down. One thing you could do is, you want to make sure to always kind of, keep removing the perennial weeds from your garden. So you might have to go through and do a little weeding so that doesn't become a problem in the future. But you might think about finding a cover crop seed that winter kills. A good source for this is a company called Albert Lee Seeds, and this is in southern Minnesota. They sell, you can look it up, or you can Google winter kill cover crops. So things that are going to terminate with the frost so that they don't come back and turn into a perennial weed. So think about broadcasting in a thick stand a month before our first frost. That could even grow along with your crops. And you're going to get some growth on those cover crops. And now, okay, so I'm just going to describe a situation which I would find to be like ideal, what's going to provide the best conditions for that soil biology. Broadcast the cover crop, get some growth on that crop before the first frost. And then maybe the frost will come, it'll knock that back a little bit. Then you can take some straw, put that over the cover crop, and kind of push all that down. And now your bed is ready. Or you could take a tarp if you want to accelerate the process. Your cover crop has grown a little bit. Now frost is coming. Now you put your tarp down, and now that will suppress weeds right away in the spring, and it'll accelerate the decomposition process in the springtime. So springtime comes, you peel the tarp back. Hopefully some of that residue is broken down, but if not, that's okay, because these winter kill crops, all of that residue laying on the top, now it's like you're making mulch for the garden for next year. You can just plant right into that. Do a little light weeding if you miss some weeds, but you can just plant kind of right into that. Or fall time, also a good time you could apply compost, a small layer of compost as well, and put a tarp over that to prevent any potential weed seeds from sprouting like that. Yeah, so that's kind of a seasonal view of our gardening. And for our last bit, maybe we can go to the next slide, because these here we've got a little recommended reading list, because see, this is just the tip of the iceberg of information that we could deliver. And also, everybody has their own technique and their own style. And so, but at the core, understanding the soil health, I think is important. And then each individual can interpret, how do I use the resources I have? Or how do I want to do it? But these are some great books just to get it. They'll go kind of a more in-depth understanding of how these things work. So our biggest influence is the market gardener, Jean Martin, who talks about growing vegetables on a small scale. Emily, one of Emily's favorites is Aaron Benzakein from Floret, which is a big flower farm in Washington. And then the kind of one of the standard people is Elliot Coleman, who helped develop a lot of these bio-intensive kind of planting a lot on a little bit of space. And then this is a new one, The Living Soil Handbook by Jesse Frost. And here, if you want to learn more about cover crops, you want to learn more about mulching, about soil biology, this is a great, great book. And it's very recent, so it's very up to date. Yeah, we've got a couple minutes left. If you want to go to the next slide, we can field any questions that are outstanding. I can kind of check out the chat here.
Is there any other way to describe it besides?
Okay, we do have a few questions. Brenda, yes, the video is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably sometime on Monday. So if you'd like to email me, I can send you the link to the recording. Don't add your email address to the chat because I've got a lot of moving parts. I won't be able to save it and get it to my email. So it's just easier for everybody to email me directly. And I'm adding that right now. So here you go. It's Jay Gilbertson at wholefoods.coop. You can go ahead and request that link. Anne wanted to clarify, last year's above raised garden bed hasn't been touched yet this year. Instead of using a shovel to turn the soil, the weeds, grass growing scattered on the surface, I should use a tined rake to just loosen the top couple of inches.
Okay. I'm just reading the chat as well, so I can get an understanding. Okay, so raised garden bed. Well, okay, so now if you're talking about weeds and grass, okay, it is going to be important to, I'm sorry for the rain here too, if y'all are hearing this. It is going to be important to remove the weeds the best you can. But if there's kind of material that is clearly, plant residue that has died, that's totally fine to just leave on the surface. You're going to enter another challenge with the raised beds because it's different than plain growing in like a field. So you may be also extracting the nutrient content in that raised bed. So I think with the raised beds, there's another question about raised gardens. So I think finding good compost is critical to the raised bed gardening to keep introducing that organic material. And that organic material also in that compost is going to have nutrients. I wouldn't be afraid in that raised bed to add your primarily nitrogen-based fertilizer. Nitrogen is the one water-soluble nutrient. So this is something that will be kind of washed out through a lot of irrigation, and something that the plants will use. So a great nitrogen source, you can find this in garden centers, is blood meal. Otherwise, what we use, which is really great, is composted chicken manure. If folks are local to Duluth here, you can go to Dan's Feed Bin and you can buy a bag of, you ask them for composted chicken manure. It comes in like a crumble or like a pellet, and they have an organic version, and in like a 4x8 foot, raised bed, standard kind of raised bed. I mean, you're going to want to apply, 2 or 3 cups. A little bit goes a long way. But that chicken manure is going to provide a great source of nitrogen, and you're going to notice immediate effects in your garden from adding that good nitrogen source every year. Okay.
So for adding new soil to the raised bed, you would probably want to do like a mix of compost and just a kind of standard potting mix. Maybe put some wood chips down on the bottom to bulk it up a little bit. You could even do some like gravel or rock on the bottom for drainage. But yeah, it's going to be important to keep introducing new compost to that raised bed every year.
Mm-hmm. And there's another question about leaving compost on the surface for raised bed. Absolutely. You don't necessarily have to work that compost in or mix it completely thoroughly with the soil below. See, because when you add, especially if you add, a couple inches of compost on the top surface, the subsoil, the existing soil, will kind of start merging with the compost, and that biology will start pulling and breaking down that compost on the surface. So, and if the compost is done correctly, and a lot of those weed seeds, if the compost is brought up to temperature correctly, a lot of those weed seeds should have been cooked out and eliminated. And if you just lay that compost on top, maybe you put your fork in there to loosen the soil a bit and lay your compost on top, and that's going to do just fine for you. Okay.
Go to the next slide, Jen. You'll be able to see our contact information. If anyone does have questions for us, they want to know a little bit
More
more,
information, come visit the farm.
visit the farm, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and our email there as well, and phone number if you have any questions.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for the wonderful questions. And John and Emily, thank you so much for your presentation. One quick question about Fairhaven's pizza nights. When is that going to start?
Oh my gosh. Well, so that's the other big exciting thing that at our farm, we are starting a pizza farm. So we've built a wood-fired oven, and now we are going to spend this year constructing a building and a kitchen so that we can accommodate serving food to the public. And so we'll have regular updates on our social media, but we probably won't have full season of pizza nights until next season, because it's kind of a crazy time to build a building right now. But this is something we've been aspiring to and planning for a really, really long time. We're really excited to bring folks out to the farm and make fresh pizzas with ingredients that are harvested literally steps away from the kitchen. So thanks for asking about that, Jen. I know you're excited about it.
I'm so excited. I can't wait. So, yeah, wonderful news. Thank you again so much for sharing all of that. And again, everybody, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Fairhaven Farm. You can find them on Facebook too, and you get lots of cute shots of their farm dog Bonus, as well as updates on their CSA and other offerings throughout our community. So with that said, again, if anybody is interested in getting the link to the recording, you can go ahead and email me directly, and I'll get that to you sometime on Monday. And I want to say thank you again for taking time out of your Saturday and learning about gardening with us. There's always lots of questions, and I find that it's better to go to somebody with the knowledge than try to figure it out yourself sometimes. So thank you for that. Shelley said, thank you for offering this class. It was positively wonderful. Learned so much as a beginner gardener. Well, thank you, Shelley, and everyone. I just hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Hopefully we'll see you at the next class that's hosted with Emily and John, and that's going to be the first Thursday of June. So
Great.
we're going to go ahead and end today. Thanks again, guys. So good to see you.
Thanks,
You bet.
Jen.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.